Interesting comment that we had when from last week, and this really ties into what you're talking about. And we've done podcasts on this before, but Janeway 777 said, "Warning from New Zealand: we crashed 30% and more. I'd sell now if I was over leveraged in Australia. So
Yep.
many Kiwis who bought huge mortgages are now stuck with homes worth hundreds of thousands less than purchased and can't sell them. If they got out in 2021, they would have been fine. Now they're stuffed. It's been a buyer's market for years and no sign of change.
Yep.
In
And
fact,
Canada.
yeah, and Canada. In fact, prices are forecast to drop again in 2026, she says,
Yep.
exclamation mark. Auctions are dead. Sale signs stay up for months. In 2020, we were booming 6 to 10% growth year on year. In fact, it was more than that, I think.
It was massive.
Yeah, lol. If only we knew that this was about to happen. And this is a warning because you did gosh, we did a podcast for my subscribers a while back now, and you know that my whole sort of article was on, if you want to know how the downturn's going to impact Australia, have a look at New Zealand and
Yep.
Canada. I
100%.
know you won't have those charts with you at the moment.
Oh, no, I don't, but I can talk about them because I actually wrote an article about this earlier this week. So, yeah, so New Zealand's home prices are down more than 30% in real terms. I think in nominal terms it's close to 20. So they peaked, I think it was 2022. And Canada also peaked about the same time, and they're down by a similar amount as well, right? So both markets went up heaps, they fell. New Zealand had the biggest boom post-pandemic in house prices in out of all the countries I follow, right? So all the Anglosphere countries and a few others. So I'll just say the biggest in the advanced world. I could be wrong. There's probably some other one out there which was bigger, but I don't know about it. So one of the biggest, and Canada also had a big boom. Both of them have now had massive house price declines, and interestingly, Canada's migration has also gone negative. So Canada's population actually fell last year, fell by 100,000. The whole that shrunk. And I mentioned, I won't go into it again, but Canada's rents have fallen, I think, for 17 or 18 consecutive months. They've fallen about 7% from their peak. So it's becoming rapidly more affordable. But their house prices actually started falling before immigration was falling. And, you know, Bank of Canada lifted interest rates higher than the RBA did. Reserve Bank of New Zealand did as well. Admittedly, their markets shouldn't be as sensitive to interest rates because they're more on fixed terms. So they've got more fixed rate mortgages. New Zealand, at least 3 to 5 years fixed rates. In Australia, most of our mortgages are variable. So when the RBA changes rates, it impacts us quicker than it does when the RBNZ or the Bank of Canada does. But irrespective, their housing markets have fallen sharply. And this week, or I should say last week, I think it was Bank of New Zealand, sorry, ANZ Bank, and I think it was Westpac, both forecast that New Zealand house prices are going to fall again this year in light of the rise of the Middle East war. So Westpac, I think it was 1%, ANZ 2%. It's not a lot, obviously, but that comes after years of price declines. And the Bank of New Zealand has released research this week, which I only skim read before I came to the show, so I haven't absorbed the details. But the headline of that was that basically they think that New Zealand house prices in real terms are going to go back to 2016 levels. So they're going to go back to where they were a decade ago once you adjust for inflation. So at the moment, they're tracking at 2019 levels. And the Bank of New Zealand believes that once you adjust for inflation, New Zealand house prices are going to go back a decade ago. They go back to 2016 levels. So yeah, look, all this shows you is that, New Zealand, Canada, Australia had similar massive house price booms over 20 odd years or more. We kind of tracked each other pretty closely. All three of us ran very high migration programs. Ours was bigger than the other two, but big. And Canada and New Zealand have cut their migration. They'll have had massive reductions in migration. Australia hasn't. But irrespective, this does show you that house prices in countries like ours, which are very similar banking systems, similar addiction to property, all that sort of stuff, they can fall, and they can fall quite heavily. And as that commenter said, people who bought near the top have been burnt in New Zealand, which is why I keep saying that I don't think now is a great time to be leveraging the property. Now, obviously, if you need somewhere to live, right, and you're sick of renting or whatever, it's a lifestyle choice, right? It's not investment. And if you're looking to buy in Melbourne, for example, Melbourne's going to be pretty relatively safe because we've basically gone backwards in real terms over the last, 5 or 6 years, maybe 7 years. I'm losing count now. But as that table showed before, Melbourne home prices are relatively affordable. So because we haven't had that big run up in price over the last 5 years, where we don't have the risk of a big downside in price. But that's not the same for some of the other markets. So yeah, I guess my point is be careful out there, right? So don't overstretch yourself, thinking that property only ever goes up. I've got to get in now before it's too late, blah, blah, blah. Because all you have to do is, if you don't believe me, you don't believe Catherine, just go and do some research yourself. Go and look at New Zealand housing market, go and look at the Canadian housing market, both arguably the most similar economies in the world to us, both culturally and economically. And in the case of New Zealand, we've got exactly the same banking system. Our big four banks are their big four banks, right? Canada's probably more structurally close to us in their composition of their economy and their parliamentary system as both Westminster systems. New Zealand's a bit different there, but New Zealand has the same banking system. So these housing corrections can happen. We just haven't had one in Australia, like a big one, in most of our living memories. But it doesn't mean it can't happen. So, it's always bears being careful out there.
Mm, mm. I talking about property downturns. I mean, I think what part of the problem is that we just haven't had induced property recession for quite a period of time. We didn't have it during COVID. And then if you go back to 2008, when the world was crashing, Australia was rocketing up to a new peak in 2010 based on the Rudd's government first home buyer boost stimulus, which gave first home buyers over $30,000 to purchase property with in some cases, as well as stimulating infrastructure and putting $1,000 in everybody's bank account. But you go prior to that, go whiz back 18 years prior to that, 2008, and the 1991 crisis was really bad. Really hit Melbourne and Sydney quite dramatically, and median prices in the commercial sector went down 50-60% in real terms, and the same in the 1974 crisis. I think the problem is that people just don't have memories to remember that. You kind of like if you're under 40 years old, you're not going to be thinking about what happened in those downturns, but they were really bad. And when I look at the data for those, when I look at individual property prices, I mean, individual property prices halved from peak to trough. So if you bought something at the peak for 800,000 and then tried to sell, so say you bought in 1989 for 800,000 and then tried to sell it in 1995, which was around where the bottom came, then you were selling it for 400,000 or even less. And people's memories are just short when it comes to these things. They don't have the historical references as to the periods that we've been through previously.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm 48, right? So I'm getting up there. But even in my living memory, we haven't had a big, because in the early 90s when I was still at school. So it doesn't really register. I do remember the massive strikes in Melbourne, that the trams having to somehow walk home from school and stuff from kilometers because there was tram strikes and stuff like that. I do remember that stuff. And but that was early 90s. I was in 1991, I was in year 8, I was 13. And so I wasn't attuned to the housing market and that kind of thing back then. So I haven't lived through, and in 2008, I did own a home. I bought a home in 2006. That was my first house. But it so most people who are watching this don't have the living memory of a big housing correction. But which again is why I like to look overseas to countries that are similar, and you sort of want to learn from those countries. And at least you don't have to follow exactly, like, obviously every country is different and we're not going to ever track someone else perfectly, whatever, but it should at least be screaming warning to you. And especially given that chart I showed earlier of the differences in the decoupling of borrowing capacity against home prices. Like, there's just such a gap between what the affordability of housing is based on current interest rates, let alone where interest rates are going, according to the financial markets, etc., and what the prices are at the moment. And when you have that big gap, it just means that eventually those two lines between borrowing capacity and prices have to converge some way. And unless we get big, sharp interest rate cuts, which I still think will probably happen next year, like once the recession hits and that sort of thing, or recessionary-like conditions, the rise in unemployment, whatever. But until we get to that, there could be a fair bit of pain.